Okay, so our webinar is now live. It looks like we have some participants already joining. We'll probably give it another minute to let people come in because I see the participant number is still rising. Thanks. All right, looks like we've got a number of people just joining. So for everyone, thank you so much for coming to this session on inequality today. We've got a really great lineup. And so we have only 3 papers in the session. So we're gonna do 25 minutes of presentation and 8 minutes of discussion. And there should definitely be time for Q&A. I'll just ask the audience that we are going to use the Q&A window, so feel free to put your questions into the Q&A window at any point during the talk. And so our first speaker talking about a topic near and dear to my own heart is going to be Michelle Muller-Iden from University of Notre Dame, and she's talking about mentoring and the dynamics of affirmative action. So Michelle, take it away and feel free to go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about this research. This is joint work with Annika Öhr, who is also on the call. And what we're trying to do is to look at some of the stylized facts that have been shown by the empirical literature that are true about what determines the strength of mentoring, and then ask as a theory question what the implications are for the conversation around the affirmative action and the optimal workforce composition. So to start, the specific facts that we are going to assume to hold true in our model is that we have seen that race or gender or other sociodemographics often matter for the type of connections that we have. And mentor relationships are typically stronger between members of the same group. We also know that mentorship matters for professional achievement. We know that the achievement difference can almost disappear when introductory classes are taught by minority instructors, or that take-up just increases strongly. We also know that sometimes faculty fail to see talented students that are different from them. And we also see that oftentimes these differences manifest themselves quite early on with the type of educational choices that people take. So there is this report about the economics profession in particular that shows that basically the makeup of the undergraduate student body is very similar to that of the academic workforce, which hints to the fact that people don't select into some of these professions. And so because people do not select into these professions, the next generation around, there are even few mentors to go on. And so sort of dynamically, these inequalities, these imbalances make it worse and worse. And so you want to ask this in a simple tractable theory model. We want to ask 2 key questions. First of all, if these are all true, what does that imply for what the optimal workforce composition is? And second, what are some of the takeaways from this that maybe that are not highlighted enough in the current debate around affirmative action policies? Now, in terms of the theory literature, the closest related paper is the one by Athey, Avery, and Zemsky, and I'm very honored to have Susan discuss our paper afterwards. If you are already familiar with that model, I want to make it easy for you, is that in the big lines, our model is very similar to that one. There are some stylistic differences, but by far the biggest and most consequential is that in their model, the population is comprised of 2 groups that are of equal size. We will relax this one and we will assume that the population is made up of 2 groups, but one is a majority and one is a minority. Sorry, I saw a chat pop up. you're not familiar with that paper, let me go through our model. So what we're going to do is an overlapping generations model where each generation lives for 2 periods. In each period, a unit mass of juniors enters, and each junior has 2 parts that make up his or her identity. First of all, a junior has a talent that's distributed according to some continuous distribution, and he belongs to one of the 2 groups, which is assumed that he draws a group membership at random, and he belongs to the majority with some probability B that's greater than 1/2, and otherwise he belongs to the minority group 2. So these 2 things are drawn independently, which in particular means that we assume that there are no talent differences across the 2 groups. One is just simply bigger and more frequent than the other. And then upon birth, each junior decides whether they want to participate in the workforce or whether they want to exit. If they exit, they get a payoff of 0. If they participate, they need to invest into education, and education is costly. So we're going to assume a simple additive form where there is some fixed cost of education that is decreased by however much talent you have. So the more talented you are, the cheaper it is for you to get educated. And then it also decreased by the mentoring that you receive. I will get into this mentoring function in a slide or 2, but what I want you to notice here is just that we assume it's some function that's determined by how many current seniors of your group are, how many current seniors of the other group, how many participating juniors of your group and of the other group. So those are the 4 things that will determine how much mentoring you will receive. And then if you participate, you have this costly education, but then afterwards you generate a surplus and you get hired in a competitive labor market. So essentially you will earn your surplus as a wage as long as there is no intervention. And so naturally you invest if your expected benefit outweighs your cost. Now, to fix ideas a little bit, I want to give you a numerical example of this model. I'm going to make it 1 step simpler than what I had just written up by assuming that talent is simply binary, not continuous. So I'm going to assume that I have a population that's made up of 80% majority. I'm going to normalize the surplus that you generate if you get educated to 1. And then I'm going to assume that 1/4 of all people have high talent. And I'm just going to assume that they have no cost of education. And 3/4 are of low talent who have some positive cost of education. And then I'm going to assume a specific mentoring technology. So here I'm going to assume that the mentorship boost comes from role model effects. So essentially what I'm going to assume is that there is whoever is currently seniors are just going to pick 10 random seniors and make them into role models. And then if you're a junior and you have a role model that is like you, you get a unit boost. If there is no role model like you, you don't get that boost. And you have to make your decision before the role models are drawn. So it's really about the likelihood that you will find a role model. If that's the case, then the individual rationality just boils down to, well, the high types, they have no cost of education, but they can earn a surplus of 1. So they will always invest into education. But the low type juniors invest if and only if their cost is lower than the benefit. So this is the benefit that they get is the C has to be smaller than the expected mentoring surplus. So the likelihood that you don't find any role model that's like you is 1 minus 5 to the power of 10. So that is an increasing function in phi. So essentially you will invest if there are enough people like you in the senior workforce. And to make things simple, we just said C so that you will invest when there are at least 35% of the current seniors that are like you. And so if we set it up this way, then we can I want to think through 4 possible compositions that the workforce could have. So those are 1 through 4 here. On top, I wrote the high type and the low type for each, majority and minority, and then there's a dot if those people are participating in the workforce. So the first, and then in the bottom, sorry, at the bottom, I just calculated out what that means. If those are the workforces, how many people will actually be majority. So that's why you have the first number. And the second number, I calculated out what the total surplus is. That's maybe a little bit less transparent, but if you just take time and calculate through it, you can get those numbers. So the first thing I want to do is to think about these compositions to see what the steady states are. We said high types always invest, low types invest if there are at least 35% that are like them. So it's always, since the majority is always at least 35%, the low type majority will always invest. So that rules out 2 and 4 as a steady state. But the low types are in 3, the low types of minority participants make up only 20%. So it's not individually rational for them to participate. So the only steady state among those 4 is composition 1. So that's what we would expect to happen in the steady state here, that all the majority participates, but only the highly talented minority. Now you might argue that that's not a fair outcome because your achievement depends on your group membership. And it might be better if we somehow adjust this market to get to something where either only all the high types or everybody invests, because then your type doesn't matter for what you achieve in life. And so we can make the argument that those 2 are more fair. Now, what's surprising though is if you look at the last line, where I noted down the total surplus, we actually get something even stronger. We get that the one that actually maximizes welfare is the one that's overshooting in a sense, and that overrepresents the minority. And so it's a simple stylized example, but it captures a lot of the features of our model. And what I'm trying to convince you is that this can actually happen often, and that thinking about this, the optimal surplus maximizing workforce, if there are these mentoring patterns, can in some sense be an even stronger argument for affirmative action than simply trying to make types not matter, as in a fairness narrative. So for mentoring, in the paper, we make explicit assumptions on what the function has to satisfy. Because it's a bit notation heavy for a 25-minute presentation, I'm instead just going to walk through 2 examples of what types of mentoring stories would fit our paper. The first one is essentially the one I just talked about. So you could think about role models, and some role models are drawn at random. We can add a little bell and whistle here, where we assume it's not just whether or not you have any role models that matters, but that having 2 role models is slightly better than having 1 role model. And so we can assume that your total payoff is sort of increasing in the number of role models that you get, and we can think about the expected boost that you will get. That will give us a mentorship boost function that has 3 notable features. The first one is, if that's the story, if that's what determines mentoring, then we see that here mentoring is completely independent of the junior participation. There is no competition for mentors. A role model can be a role model for however many people there are. The other thing that we see is that if you add a senior of the opposite group, it hurts me directly because it decreases the likelihood that I will find a role model. And so it has a negative effect if you add a senior member of the opposite group. And the third factor, which is going to be important for getting our results, is that we call Q, so this is here the number of role models that are drawn. We call this the mentor capacity. If you make that big enough, then first of all, there are a lot of role models around, so the likelihood that you get some is high. So all the boosts will go to 1 point-wise. But more importantly, the returns from representation are strongly decreasing. So if you're thinking about how much more benefit you get from having 1% or 2% like you in the population, it's a much bigger difference than going from 50 to 51%. And that is going to be key. Now, it could be that you think that that's not really how mentoring works at all. And the mentoring is really more about sort of these bilateral relationships. And here also we have a story that would fit our model. So you could think about a discrete matching market where you have a bipartite random network. On one side, you have seniors. On the other side, you have juniors. And then you just randomly match them and you assume that the probabilities are such that on average, each mentor is matched with Q mentees. So Q will again be our mentor capacity, how many mentees per mentor. And you can even incorporate some things that you might think are relevant and that might sort of help. So you could just incorporate partial assortativity, where you assume that some fraction of the matches are reserved for same group juniors, and you also want to assume that there is a difference, that same group, if you're being matched with somebody like you, it's more effective than being matched with somebody not like you, but it doesn't need to be a fully successful, fully unsuccessful story. So it could be that it's also beneficial for me to have an opposite group mentor. It's just not as good in expectation as having a same group mentor. That gives you some complicated formula of expected mentorship boost if you let then n go to infinity. But yeah, I just want to highlight 3 key factors. So here we actually have a situation where I'm in competition with other juniors. So mentors are sparse, and if you add more juniors, that decreases the mentorship that I will get. We also now have a situation where if you add an opposite type mentor, that actually helps me. Not as much as if you add a same group mentor, but it's beneficial. So those two, neither of those two are going to be driving our results because they're different across the 2 examples. But what's in common with the previous example is if you take mentor capacity large, the boosts all go to 1, and that the returns from mentorship, the returns from representation are strongly decreasing. And so then what we're trying to do is to maximize total surplus. For tractability, we only consider constant labor forces. So we consider a long-term view where the juniors are equal to the seniors. And we call the fraction of group 1 the labor force composition. And then we want to maximize total surplus, which essentially is just, here is the individual surplus of a person from group 1 with talent X. And so we multiply or integrate across everybody. And then we want to compare our narrative to that of a fairness story. And so we say that a labor market is fair if the marginal talent, the talent of the marginal worker is the same across both groups. So in another way of saying that is if it doesn't increase, if it's not welfare enhancing for you to be born into the other group. If the talent of the marginal worker is lower for one group, they are better off. And so they say that the labor market is biased in favor of that group. And one thing that we also often have is that the labor market is dominated by the majority if it's more than half of the majority. So in particular, what we will find is that oftentimes the optimal labor force has between 50% and B of the majority, which means that there's more majority than minority in the workforce, but relative to population, the minority is overrepresented. And if you look at the marginal talent of the marginal minority participant, it's lower than that of the majority participant. All right, so just to recap, the key parameters that you have to remember is that we have B to represent how many people are of the majority. We assume that that's greater than 0.5. And we have Q that sort of says how many mentees per mentor, how many, what's the mentor capacity. We want that to be large enough so that the returns from representation are strongly decreasing. And then we look at steady states, and we first show that if you have any majority dominant workforce, so if you start out with at least 50% majority in the population, you will always go to a steady state where you have more than B% majority in the population. So you will end up with a bias towards the majority. That's sort of what happens if you don't intervene. So that also in particular means we don't rule out steady states where the minority is overrepresented. And referees often point to examples like South Africa, where we have a minority that makes up the majority of the upper level workforce. That's possible within this model. But what it says is that would never emerge spontaneously. You never sort of get there naturally. But once it's there, it might be a steady state. We also look at what happens if you take mentor capacity to infinity. Then you will eventually get a steady state that's very close to B. It will still be overrepresenting the majority, but will get very close to B. And that will be the best steady state among all steady states. So if you're thinking about what you should do if you're a social planner, but you can only do temporary interventions, basically the answer from here is that if you have large enough mentor capacity, you just want to get the workforce to more or less represent the population, and then it will go to a steady state that's close to being fair, and that's indeed the best steady state that you can hope to get. But the question is, can we do better? If we don't restrict ourselves to temporary interventions, can we do better? And here we get what I think is the most exciting result, is that we show that if we have these uneven sizes, the optimal workforce composition will always be majority dominant. We'll have more than 50% of the majority. But if we have high enough mentor capacity, we will actually have less than B majority. We will be biased towards the minority. So we will have the optimal composition somewhere between 0.5 and B. The intuition for that is that juniors simply do not internalize their own mentoring benefits for the next generation. So they decide whether they want to invest, they think about the mentoring that they will receive, but they do not think about the mentoring that they will give. And a minority worker has a skill to mentor future minorities. That skill is in rare supply, and so it's more valuable. And so sometimes when we hear this in the conversation around affirmative action, there's this argument that if you have affirmative action, it's unfair to a majority because they had the same GPA and then they were rejected. Well, what this suggests is that that argument might fail to take into account these determinants of mentoring, because if that's true, if that's really how mentoring works, then there is the mentoring skill in which they differ. And the minority person has a skill to mentor future minority, which is a rare skill that is valuable, that the majority person with the same talent simply does not have. And so thinking about this in terms of internalizing an externality, it somehow becomes standard economics that you would want to veer to that side. And if you combine the two results, because we know that there are no steady states over here, it means that you would always intervene, you would not stop. So here's a picture with the role model mentoring story that mentoring technology that I talked about earlier. The result that I highlighted here is this region B. So if you have mentor capacity high enough, then your optimal composition has between 0.5 and B majority. And then the steady states are all more than B% majority. And so if you're anywhere in this region, you would want to intervene persistently. Now, if you get Q larger and larger, eventually the tension here disappears. That's this fact that if you take Q to infinity, and eventually they both sort of go to B. But for intermediate but high enough values, you would have this persistent intervention. And so if we think back to policy implications, it means that if the returns from mentorship are sufficiently decreasing, then the optimal policy is biased in favor of the minority. So it goes further than simply trying to level the playing field, and requires persistent intervention of non-vanishing force. Now, this does not happen if the population groups are equal. And so it also means that if you're thinking about affirmative action for gender, for example, where population groups are similar, it might be reasonable to assume that those are temporary. But if you're thinking about race, it might not be so obvious. And I think it's important because it goes contrary to two assumptions that are sort of shared by everybody in the affirmative action conversation and are rarely put into question. And you can find them in Supreme Court opinions and presidential addresses. This idea that affirmative action just has to be a temporary measure and that by virtue of its own success, it will render itself obsolete. Well, our analysis sort of questions that, at least questions it if you cannot improve mentoring. If mentoring technology is fixed, then maybe that is not so clear that that should be the goal. And also that fairness, which I think is well captured by this idea of equal opportunity for equal talent being the goal. Well, again, if mentoring is determined that way, then you have to take that into account. You should add that to your description of somebody, not just the talent. We also look at specific policy instruments rather than just saying, okay, what would the social planner tell everybody to do if he could force everybody to participate or not. But we show that he could actually achieve this by just implementing educational subsidies, and they would be budget neutral in the long run. He could also use hiring quotas, and then the competitive market would sort of adapt itself. It works the same way in our model if the market wage can adapt freely, but it would imply that the minority actually earns higher equilibrium wages, which is not something that we typically observe in the real world. And so what we say is that if market wages are somewhat rigid, maybe they cannot be different across groups, then hiring quotas are actually problematic because they lead to employment insecurity for the majority. And of course, everything here, so if you take Q larger, if mentorship gets more efficient, then this tension, you can also make it disappear. And so I think this is also an important point, is that if we can find programs that really work at making types matter less for mentorship or making people be better mentors for people that are unlike them, that could also have real benefits. And that could go against the need for some of these affirmative action policies. So cross-group exposure, mentor training, networking support for minority youth, those are all valuable. We cannot really compare them because whether or not these are efficient and how costly they are to implement is really at the end of the day an empirical question, but they are definitely worthwhile endeavors. And that is it.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. That was great. So if you could actually stop sharing, and I'm the discussant for this first paper, so I will start my own discussion. And then just for the people in the audience, please feel free to go ahead and put questions in the Q&A window, and we will leave some time to answer those as well. And everybody can see my screen okay? Yep. Okay. So just first of all, I was really excited to see this paper. As I mentioned, this is really near and dear to my own heart, and I'll try not to do too much personal discussion, but I will say, this is a topic I started working on in 1992 in my summer first year of graduate school, when I noticed myself this sort of group-based mentoring advantage that some of my colleagues got. And the paper that we wrote ended up getting published in the year 2000. And I tried to kind of take this to a broader research agenda, but it was kind of hard to build a community around it. There weren't that many people working on these topics, and people liked this paper that I wrote, but it was hard to kind of find a research agenda around it. So I'm really excited because I think this is a time now where a lot of young people are interested in this question, and there's really so much to do. So I think there's fertile fruit here, and I really like this paper. So let me just I'll summarize and then make some comments. First of all, just the big picture dynamic of diversity. Diversity isn't just about fairness or redress, but we can observe, just like I did, and many of us have, that group membership can contribute to productivity. Now, mentoring is a broad term. I think personally, I hoped, well, once you got out of the kind of young people going to bars and all the romance drama and things like that of graduate school, that, you know, things would get easier. But then, of course, there's kids. And sadly, even for people as old as me, you still see things that where different groups can be left out of activities and the corresponding opportunities to find co-authors or collaborations or build trust or get business deals, et cetera. And the real thing in this model is that diversity today affects the productivity of younger workers tomorrow, and that occurs differentially across groups. And so generally, the broad theme, which is very robust, I think, across a broad class of models, is that if talent or worker firm match quality is heterogeneous, failing to make the most out of a minority group's talent is inefficient. And so that's the real thing that I think gets left out of a lot of the popular discussion, although, you know, you sometimes see it discussed, but it's really that, you know, if talent is scarce and we want every individual to be able to contribute to productivity as much as possible. And if they miss out on the chance for mentoring and they either don't invest in their human capital or they're not given the chance to be promoted by a firm, that's inefficient. And so one of the other really key themes is that investments, in this model, the investments are by workers, and in my model, it was by firms. But in either case, investments in minority participation or promotions has an externality. That is, having minorities succeed today makes future high talent minority workers more productive. And in general, there are diminishing returns from a variety of sources. And the paper does micro foundations of how that would happen from mentoring. But also there's, if you're thinking about only promoting a subset of people, there's diminishing returns to having more of the same group if you're in terms of finding the best people. So it's generally going to be more efficient to make sure that there's the first minorities succeed rather than the last majority types. So I think it was presented nicely. I'll just very briefly review that the paper does some nice micro foundations of the mentoring benefit. The point is that a critical parameter for the model is that how fast are returns diminishing for having more majority group mentors for mentoring. And so I think what's very nice and fleshed out in several micro models is that indeed it's very plausible when you think of the mechanics of how this works, that there are diminishing returns and they probably diminish relatively quickly. And they look at, you know, role models as well as bilateral mentoring with frictions, and both of those lead to diminishing returns. And again, those diminishing returns are important for the policy recommendations. The major results are that if the economy starts out with more participation of the majority type without intervention, it can end up with overrepresentation of the majority. It's possible that you can get a minority steady state, but you kind of you wouldn't naturally gravitate there. With strongly diminishing returns to more same type mentors, there's two main results. One is about steady states and one is about what's efficient. So the most efficient, stable, steady state has labor force participation match the population. That makes the best use of talent. And so if you start out from not proportional representation, affirmative action policies that move you towards that in the short run can lead you to a stable, steady state in the long run that's more efficient. But it can be even more efficient if you can have long run intervention, to have the labor force participation overrepresent minorities over time. And this is basically because there's an externality. Again, when you decide about participation, minorities don't internalize the benefit they have on future workers. And due to diminishing returns, each minority worker has a greater spillover on future generations than an additional majority. So persistent intervention is required to achieve this overrepresentation of minorities, but it's efficient. And you can get there by subsidizing education or rewarding participation and so on. So when I think about the policy for firms and industries, first of all, the biggest point I think is the most important point maybe for practice is actually outside the model, in the sense that it's about changing the primitives of the model. You know, the model does comparative statics. How does the mentoring function relate to what happens in steady state? But overall, type-based mentoring is not really exogenous. You know, your firm can take a hunting trip as a law firm, or your firm can do something else, and you can decide. And firms, I'm on actually a bunch of boards of directors now, and a lot of our boards have tried to change cultures and find activities that are inclusive, that, whether it's parents of young children, men and women, different ethnic backgrounds, can actually participate. And a lot of times your preferences are endogenous. So really in the long run, it shouldn't be that hard to find something that everybody likes to do that's more inclusive. And I think that's like the biggest action item we can take. An extra effort is required, though, to make the most of scarce human capital. But nowadays, firms really view this as an investment in culture that will help them recruit. And especially like Silicon Valley tech firms have a hard time recruiting engineers. Talent is very scarce. And so they view themselves, if they can make people successful of different types, they can actually, that's a competitive advantage for them. Finally, part of the reason I got motivated to write my own paper in '92 was that I was tired of, when I would bring up these observations I had, people would kind of poo-poo you and say, well, gosh, the markets must be working. So if I observe that the existing institutions aren't fair and other people are getting more mentoring because they're allowed to play basketball with the professors and women were explicitly not allowed, well, you should just deal with it because, markets are efficient, and it's too bad if they're unfair, but we should let firms and do what they want because markets work. Now, this type of model allows you to see that actually both short and long-term intervention, affirmative action, improves efficiency. Of course, once you make that argument, then critics come back and say, oh, wait, no, this is unfair. So it's a little bit of a moving target about the criticisms of affirmative action. At first, we said, well, the firms must be doing what's optimal. Nowadays, firms want to put in affirmative action, and universities want to put in affirmative action, presumably in part because they are efficient and they're internalizing those factors, but then people criticize them as being unfair. And so I think we need to remember that a diversity policy can be both efficient and profit maximizing. Firms can view it as a capability and a strategic advantage. Universities can internalize the externality on society. And then when we think about fairness, fairness is a complex concept. It can be viewed at different points in time, and we should really think about fairness at birth, fairness when you make high school decisions, fairness when you make college decisions, and think about the incentives that different fairness concepts create and link it back to its impact. So generally, I'm super excited about this research. I already mentioned that. In future work, I think it could be interesting to explore further different elements of this whole equation. So our paper had a similar model. The math was similar, but we were focusing on firm promotions by a monopsonist firm. Today's paper focused more on worker investment decisions and market-wide inputs. Pushed somewhat by my advisor, Eddie Luzier, who thought a lot about markets and market equilibrium, we did an extension that looked at whether it was an equilibrium outcome when wages could adjust and other things could adjust to have diversity, or whether firms would just specialize in being homogeneous. But I think overall, and we showed that they could be diverse and conditions when that could happen. But I think overall, putting together firm decisions, worker decisions, investment decisions on both sides could be and market equilibrium could be a really interesting and fertile ground for future research. So I will stop there, and now we can take questions. I don't see anything yet while I'm stopping sharing in the Q&A window. I'm opening up the participants. You can also do a hand raise. Maybe while we wait for questions, if you want to respond to any of my comments, Michelle, why don't you go ahead and do that?
Yeah, I really liked your suggestions. I think in our case, the hiring firms is sort of this very super competitive small firms market. But I think combining them might be really interesting, especially to see to what extent universities or big firms have incentives to try to incorporate some of these trade-offs. And so that I really like that. Another thing that I think would be interesting for future research, but quite frankly, I've struggled to do within this framework, is to look more at questions with multiple minorities, because there's this other question: when you do affirmative action for one minority, does it hurt another minority? So we weren't sure what the right assumptions were even to make about the mentoring, how mentoring works, and so we didn't take that further. But I think those are also interesting questions to look at.
Yeah, great. David.
Yeah, so great paper. I had a question, and one of the things I really like about it is the careful thinking about the concept of mentorship capacity, because that seems really critical about what one actually means when one thinks about role modeling and mentorship. And I think you guys do this, like I sort of have a question about probing that a bit further. It seems like you guys kind of have in mind, although you didn't maybe say as explicitly, maybe it's in the paper, but not in the talk, that like a role model is somebody who can basically, like, that's role modelship you can provide it's essentially a non-rival good. Like you see somebody who's like you, and that makes you better. And so you can kind of spread it around without exhausting it as a resource. Whereas mentorship is bilateral, or like there's some kind of fixed amount of mentorship you have and you can distribute it, and you might distribute it strategically or might think about the equilibrium. And so I wonder if you might kind of take a pretty realistic example and kind of draw this out. So like, let's say you're trapped in the kind of equilibrium where the majority has more people than the minority, like you're in the kind of whatever, the equilibrium you guys are basically considering. And you have two options. One is you can provide, you can basically increase representation and create a role model. And that role model can sort of only help people in their own group. Or you can increase mentorship opportunities, and actually the members of the majority group can mentor members of the minority group at some cost. And how do you think about the trade-offs there? Because that's a pretty realistic thing. Like if you had some kind of budget, affirmative action budget, however defined, should you be thinking about representation, or should you be thinking about increasing mentorship and like providing incentives for mentorship, given the equilibrium you're in, where you have a lot more people in the majority group than in the minority group? And maybe you add some cost about where the promoting the minority group takes time, or whatever it is you need to do to just kind of think about those cases. What are the conditions under which you would favor one versus the other? And maybe you guys do that in the paper, because it's kind of all there. Anyway, like the paper a lot. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just real quick response, because we're just about out of time. Thanks. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. We haven't really addressed. I think there are a lot of things here where a lot will be in the assumptions, and I'm not quite sure without better data we can make that. So essentially, what we do to address in the paper, we try to make a strong claim, a strong push for like it would be really helpful to have better data on what the determinants of mentorship are. I mean, it even begs the question whether a role model can be a role model for somebody in a different group too. Then that would probably be the non plus ultra if you have the non-competitive nature plus the spillovers to the other group. Yeah, I don't have a quick 1 minute smart response.
Great, thanks for the question and discussion. Now we'll move on to the next paper, which will be Mary Kaltenberg from Pace University, presenting about the impact of automation on inequality across Europe. So Mary, go ahead and share your screen. And make sure to unmute. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the impact of automation on inequality across Europe. And we're really going to be looking at inequality, more recent changes of inequality in the past 15 years or so. Historically, we know that the EU is known to have lower rates of inequality, but there's varied experiences of those changes to inequality across Europe. So there's not really any consistent patterns in terms of geography or number of years of that a country or maybe a member state in the EU in regards to recent changes. And so that's where we were diving into in understanding that effect of inequality on Europe. I'm sorry. And so I just want to make sure that you see the screen changing. I've had this problem before, the slides changing. Okay. So prior research has shown different kind of factors at mostly the cross-sectional perspective, different national factors that that might have on the recent changes in inequality. For example, labor institutions. This is particularly important in the European context, of which there is a dual market, a labor market, where there are many more fixed or tenured jobs and other types of contracts that are temporary or fixed contracts, as in a set duration of times. And that has been specifically changing after the great financial crisis, where a lot of countries have changed their labor institutions and moved into relaxing some of those regulations. There's also been evidence of a decline in union participation. This research has been mostly focused in the US, UK, and in Italy. Evidence of the role that increased financialization may have on increasing inequality, and finally, technological change. And that's going to be really the major focus of this perspective of this paper that we'll be digging into. So we know that technology is changing the labor market, and you can view this as two sort of main perspectives. One is a wage effect, where you might have changes in the demand of skills. That's meaning that the relative wage of non-routine cognitive skills has risen comparative to routine tasks, and that has been contributing to an increase in inequality. And related is the composition effect, where there are changes in the demand of jobs, where some jobs may be completely automated and therefore disappear, while other jobs may grow to complement these new technologies. And our goal in this paper is really to understand what is the contribution of each effect. And are we able to estimate how much either if one is relatively more, have a larger effect than the other? So what we do is we analyze these changes of inequality within country regarding a variety of characteristics. And what we can observe is at the individual level, including the age, gender, and education of a person, the firm of which they are employed at, so the number of years at the firm, the type of firm that they're in, and the size of the firm that they're working in, the type of industry that the firm is within, the labor market, as I mentioned, that's quite important in the European context. So we have 5 different types of contract types. So that's permanent, either part-time or full-time, fixed contracts, which are set duration of time, if they're apprentice, which in some countries matters more than others, and what I call marginally part-time, which is when somebody's 85% part-time, so they're 85% of what would be a full-time worker, and union type. Again, this is very important depending on the country, and this is denoted at the local level, meaning the city, the regional, or national level, and in some cases at the industry level. And finally, technology, which we use a measure of risk of automation, which I'll talk more about in a moment. And we compare their contributions and estimate the contribution of each of these characteristics on inequality within a country, and then we compare those results across countries. So the data that we're using is the structure of earnings surveys, and it's from 2002 to 2014, and they come out every 4 years. And we're really just going to compare the difference between 2002 and 2014. And we're going to look at the individual level. So it'll be for employees. And the data is collected by each individual country, but harmonized by Eurostat. And there are some differences in the way of that the data is collected. It could be administrative data, or in some cases, they'll do a enterprise level survey, a stratified sample. And we're going to use hourly real wages. So we do some harmonization for the industry and education categories, since there's some changes that occur across years and countries. So the risk of automation, which is, we take it from Frey and Osborne in their 2017 paper, and they had the US occupation classification, the SOC, and we convert that to the European occupation classification. And then what we do is we classify each of these risks of automation by occupation into categories, which are low, medium, and high. There's a 4th category that we do include for good measure of those that are unknown. It's a very small percentage of the data set, but basically unknown is if we're unable to appropriately classify a job from the different classification systems. It's less than 1% of the data that we have. And so what we do is we follow a decomposition method. And so I'll detail to you the steps that we do on how we're able to actually decompose the different contributions. And we follow the RIF regression decomposition method by Ferber, Fortin, and Lemieux. So we are going to compare the wage density. The first step is that we compare this wage density function between two time periods, in our case, 2002 and 2014. And that basically gives you, the differences, the overall change between any two time periods. And so just for an example through, for our methodology, I'm going to show you the wage densities for Belgium. So you can see the red line is the wage density at 2002, and in 2014 is the blue line. So the big, what major contribution to that Fortune and Lemieux had made is how can we tell differences between the wage structure and composition effects? And to do that, we create a counterfactual distribution. And so we reweight the 2014 distribution with 2002 characteristics. And essentially what we're doing is we're estimating whether an individual is in 2002. That's how we get those characteristics. And so with the different characteristics that I showed you earlier, and that's what we use to reweight the counterfactual distribution. So in the end, you get something like this. Again, the Belgian wage density, where you can see, and now these lines are quite similar together, which I think is somewhat of a good thing, is that you can see the red line is 2002 and the blue is the actual 2014, where the green line is the counterfactual. So what we're hoping to see is that you have a similar kind of wage distribution of 2014 with some differences that are accounted for the fact that we're weighting it with those 2002 characteristics. So in the end, this allows us to take differences. So we're going to subtract the difference between the 2002 distribution and the counterfactual, and that's our wage structure effect. That isolates the effect of the wage structure between the two time periods. And then we can get the composition effect by taking the difference between the counterfactual and the 2014 distribution. That way we can isolate effects of differences in composition between the 2 years. And finally, we are able to tell that overall difference between the wage and composition structure differences. But we really want to understand is how much does each covariate or each variable of interest contributes to inequality. And to do this part, we use these recentered influence regression functions, and that allows us to analyze these small disturbances. And the regression coefficients, what's nice about it, provides a pretty easy interpretation in terms of that it just estimates the change in whatever statistical interest that you might have. You can do the Gini. We also do deciles and see its response to a change in the distribution of variable that changes the unconditional average of the variable by 1 unit. So it's a rather simple way to interpret the results. And so using those actual coefficients from the RIF regression, we can then do what's quite common, a Oaxaca blinder decomposition, where we can see what is the contribution for each of the covariates in terms of the wage structure, and which is the first part of this term that you see here, and in terms of the composition effects, which is the second part of this equation term that you see in this equation. So we do this procedure for each country where we are doing this weighted RIF decomposition technique for a set of 10 countries: Belgium, Spain, Finland, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Romania, and the United Kingdom and Italy, using the structure of earnings survey, as I mentioned earlier, and decompose how individual characteristics impact inequality in terms of either Gini or deciles. So the first set of main results, now because these are, there are really a lot of results that come out from these kind of techniques from the RIF regressions. To make it a little bit simpler, I'm just showing overall summary graphs of the main results. And so what we find more strikingly that's consistent is that when we do this decomposition effect to understand what's the effect of each of these covariates on the Gini, what seems to have the largest impact in terms of these variables is automation, and they're quite large. So they tend to have the largest impact on inequality across all of the countries that we're observing, and they all tend to increase inequality. So that was kind of to see that consistency with this result with these method was surprising for us. And so when we dig down a little bit deeper, here I'm just going to show you the deciles, and this is the percent wage change between the two time periods, and to see, okay, where exactly is this impact coming from distributionally. Where you can see is that the wage increases are really happening at the top half of the distribution compared to the bottom half. The bottom half, indeed, there are some countries of which those at the 20th or 30th percentile do see negative real wages. In some cases, it's closer to zero, or a little, maybe a couple of percentage points or percentages, sorry. But certainly what we see is that the similar trend across these European countries that we've analyzed that has this positive effect, particularly at the top 30% of the distribution. Now, what's interesting about this decomposition method, we can look at it in terms, we can look at it in different ways. And just to kind of reiterate these results is that if we look at for each of the decomposition, what is that automation effect compared to relative to these other characteristics? At the bottom distribution, you see there's much less change happening if we compare the 50th to the 10th percentiles. It's in general much smaller. There are effects on automation, but really the top distribution here, where their income gains are coming from, seems to be this effect from the risk of automation. There are, of course, other characteristics that are very important at the industry and individual level and are country specific, but we see this consistent pattern that at the top end of the distribution, automation seems to have this large effect. And then, going to that main question I started off with was, what is the effect? Is it really the wage effect or this composition effect is driven from automation, is driving this increase in inequality? And what we see is there is an effect in half of our country sample of a wage effect, and it's relatively large, but there seems to be this consistent effect on the composition effect that is also quite large. And in some cases, much larger than the wage effect. So you can see this consistent positive impact on the composition effect that seems to really be driving the automation's impact on inequality in this sample of European countries. And so what we wanted to dig into is a little bit more is to really understand in our results about this composition effect. So how is it, in what way are we able to see that automation is really driving inequality? So what we found is that, the idea is that jobs that are more likely to be automated, they tend to be more equally paid. And I'll show you this in the next slide. But while low automation risk jobs, they tend to have higher inequality. So what this suggests is that in the short term, at least, as these high risk automation jobs become more automated, workers are going to move to these more low and medium risk jobs. However, those particular jobs tend to be paid more unequally. And so this might be one of the mechanisms as to what's contributing to higher inequality through that composition effect. And just to show you a little bit more on this, here's a sample of our different countries. And you can see that we have the low, middle, and high automation risk categories in the middle row. And then I provide the Gini coefficient for each of these automation risk categories and for 2002 and 2014. And what we see consistently is that the low automation risk jobs that are less likely to be automated, tend to have higher inequality. In many of cases of the countries, that actually increases over the time period that we observed. Of course, it's not for every country, but for the majority, certainly is true. And you can just compare that to the jobs that have high automation risk. They tend to be more equally paid relative to the low automation risk jobs, and they remain so quite similarly, or even become more equally paid during the time period. So when the composition, as we're seeing the composition effect, is that there are just less people being hired or working in these high automation risk jobs, and where they have left to go is either in these two other categories that tend to be paid more unequally. So just to summarize the results that we're finding in this decomposition exercise is that we find automation is increasing inequality all across Europe, at least in the 10 countries that we sampled. It explains a large portion of recent changes in inequality. That the most recent trends that we see seems to be driven by automation. Wage growth is rising much faster at the top end of the distribution comparatively. And we can see that those wage changes is more consistently seen through that composition effect. And we see that drive in rising inequality through automation is this shift in the composition of jobs, where the share of jobs in high risk automation jobs are decreasing compared to low automation jobs. What we would like that we want to consider in the future is that, we're not sure, of course, if this is temporary effect or is this a potential for long-term increase in inequality. This is, we show the past, decade of change. So this obviously could change in the future. And we have not included the impact of trade. So during this time period, and that's something that something that is also very important during this time period. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and comments and discussion.
Great, thanks so much. And so let's see, David Deming will be the discussant, and your slides look great.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. And Mary, thanks for a great paper. It was fun to read it. I think it's a really important topic, one that's on everybody's minds. I think it's also just really impressive to put together such a comprehensive data set of what's happening in a bunch of different European countries and try to tell one story that captures it all. So bravo to you guys. So I have, I guess, kind of some big picture thoughts and then a couple of particular comments. So first of all, I'll just give you, I guess, my version of the summary of the paper, which I think Mary did very well, but just so we're on the same page. I think this is a paper that's trying to study changes in the structure of earnings, sort of between 2002 and 2014. So encompassing a lot of different things that are going on, Great Recession, kind of the beginning of the dot-com bust and then boom again. So there's lots of different things happening over this period, but it's an important period for inequality, and looking at this in a broad set of European countries. And the authors are doing this decomposition, as Mary discussed, which is kind of thinking about what are the role of prices, so relative wages, skill prices, if you like, so prices for different jobs, and then quantities, that is, what jobs are becoming more or less numerous. Like, how do you think about the impact of those things for changes in inequality, using a variety of different approaches? But that's the basic idea, is to say, how far can we get looking at, which jobs are growing and shrinking and paying more or less, and to see if those are connected, and it seems like they are connected to some measures of automation risk. And I think they find, pretty broad support for the quantity side, the composition effect, and, this wage effect in about half of the countries. I think this is a quote from the conclusion that I think is a kind of one sentence that crystallizes what I think of as kind of the result, and then raises some questions for interpretation, which I'll get into. They say the composition effect is due to the fact that low automation risk jobs have more unequal wages, and the share of those jobs is rising over time, right? And so that's kind of the polarization story that we've seen in many other countries. And in a sense, this is, it's the motivation of this, even though it's automation, we say the word automation, we kind of think about something that's happening recently, but in a sense, what we're really talking about here is this multi-decade trend of what sometimes people call skill bias technological change, or routine bias technological change. Really everything that started with the computer and information technology revolution in the 80s and 90s, in some sense, the polarization story of low wage jobs growing, high wage jobs growing, middle wage jobs shrinking is kind of what they're seeing here in a more recent period. So the question is really like, is this something new? Is this just a continuation of trends? How should we think about this in context with the previous literature? And so my big picture thoughts are that I would love to see you guys dig in more into what you mean by automation and what is actually happening on the ground. And I don't mean you got to go do a bunch of case studies and like figure it all out, but I think some sense of like what is the automation that's happening? What are the jobs that are being replaced? And how is that, I think would be really useful both as a narrative device to help you understand help readers understand what's happening under the hood, and also to kind of discipline your thinking about, how is automation interact with differences in institutions across these countries. A virtue of the paper is you guys have many different countries, but of course, changes in skill prices, it's not like all these are perfectly competitive markets. In fact, none of them are. And the way that institutions interact with skill prices is going to determine a lot about what comes out of the decomposition. And so I think there's an art to a paper like this where you've got a lot of data and you're trying to tell one story or a couple of different stories. And so I would like to just see you guys dig in more and help the reader figure out what is going on. So I have a couple of suggestions on how to do that. I think one way to think about this too is that most of the time automation is not about some technological marvel that comes down from the sky. It's really, these technologies are around, but somebody finds a way to deploy them at much lower cost. And in fact, a lot of the jobs that aren't being automated probably aren't being automated because the labor that is supplied to those jobs is cheap enough that it doesn't pay to automate them, right? So you see this in the case of, for example, do drugstores and supermarkets have automated checkout, or do they have people doing it? Well, whether you have automation is very sensitive to minimum wage laws. It's very sensitive to labor laws and the extent of unionization. And so that's a story that's about technology, but it's not about technology just kind of happening. It's technology that's been around for a while, interacting with possibly differences across countries or changes in institutions. And so some of that color, do we see more automation? Do we see a bigger shift in quantities at the bottom of the wage distribution in countries where the wage floors are more important, or in countries where sectoral wage bargaining is whatever? Just, you don't have to put a number to it, but just to say, hey, well, we noticed that we see these patterns and they make sense because in this country we see this thing going on, in this other country we see that thing going on, I think helps the reader get a sense of why we're seeing the results we are, and how to think about them and connect them to automation. So again, I think you can actually look, I have a comment about Frey and Osborne, but I think you can actually look at what some of the authors like Otto Levy-Murnane do, and Eric Brynjolfsson's work, and Bartel, Ichnowski, and Shaw, where they kind of study what happens in a valve manufacturing plant when they get these computer numerically controlled machines. And then of course in Otto Levy-Murnane, they're well known for the 2003 QJE paper where they talk about routine, tech computers replacing routine tasks, but they also have a kind of companion paper in the ILRR, where they do essentially a case study of a bank and how digitization of checks, basically we used to have these people that proofread and write down the checks and kind of put them in a little ledger and add them up. And then you have this optical character recognition technology that just bulldozes that job, and how all the labor adjusts and capital adjusts and who's helped and who's harmed. And that kind of color, I think in some sense sells the technology story so much better. And if those authors I mentioned hadn't done that work, I don't think any of the rest of it would have been believable. So I'm not asking you to do all that work. That's a lot of work. But just to kind of see if you can find examples in some of these countries of people who have done that work and kind of bring it into the paper a little bit to give us some more color. So that's kind of my big picture comment. The other thing about Frey and Osborne, and why I would be a little hesitant, and again, this is not your fault, this is something everybody kind of does, is that if you look at what their measure of automation risk is, it's just they ask a bunch of people, what are the jobs you think are going to be automated? And that's fine, but it has this kind of circular logic, which is well, we think polarization is a big thing, and we look in the data and we see it's happening. So then we look at low wage jobs and high wage jobs, and we say, well, those must be low automation risk because that's what's happening. And so the question is where are the first principles operating here? Are we just saying that this is what's happening in the labor market and it must be technology? And that's where I think some of this disciplining with narrative helps too. Do we actually see that happening? So again, and just another example of that is, even I love the table at the beginning, both in the presentation and the paper, where you show the variation in the change in the Gini across countries, but that kind of cries out for explanation, right? It's the same technologies everywhere, presumably. So why do we see these differences? Can you connect it to institutions? So anyway, that's my big picture comment. And it's a friendly comment. So I don't, it's not a criticism. It's more I think it would just sell the paper much better and make it believable. So I think some details. I would love to just see more information on what is happening under the hood. So what are the jobs that are getting categorized? What are the jobs that are shrinking or growing? There's probably a small number of occupation categories that are driving a lot of this, low automation risk jobs that are growing, high risk jobs that are shrinking. Is it the same jobs in every country? Is it different jobs in different countries? just more data on what's driving the, because you kind of have this machinery that spits out a result, but there's not a lot of, the intermediate steps in the paper where you can understand what's happening. So that maybe that's just taste. I like to see what's under the hood, but I think you can do that pretty low cost. Yeah, again, like show the shifts. The other thing is there's this really nice paper by Bohm, von Gaudecker, and Schran, where they showed using employer-employee match data, I believe in Germany, that the prices and quantities are kind of endogenous. So like when demand for certain tasks is growing, you see kind of higher ability or higher wage workers shift into those, so that there's this kind of selection into growing occupations that in some sense bids the wages down or up. So basically when you see jobs that are growing faster, you actually get the marginal worker who shifts into those is less capable. And so that bids wages down a little bit. And so you see like smaller effects on wages than on shifts in occupation shares because of this endogenous sorting, which totally makes sense. But it kind of, you have to think a little bit how that feeds into the decomposition on the price side. And also, I think it'd just be interesting, like if you look at the data in the US, which I'm most familiar, what you see in terms of like the 90-50 gap or the 50-10 is that basically they're moving together, except in a recession, the low wage workers get hit really hard and the high wage workers don't. And so you see like the dot-com boom and bust, it's like boom, down for 50%. And then again, the Great Recession, it's down even more. And if you kind of just drew a line through those dips, you would see they're moving together. So is there something special about the recession here? You could look a little bit at like breaking into 2 periods or something. Okay, and I gave you my thoughts on the Freihaus-Wert index. So, one more little thing, which maybe just illustrates why this is hard to do, is that there's the kind of direct effect of jobs getting replaced by technology. And then there's also the kind of downstream effect of job creation, which is hard to measure, but really important. Like in the case of retail jobs in the US, we've seen a huge actually decline in retail jobs, not a huge decline, well, huge decline recently, but even before COVID, retail sales occupations were one of the biggest occupation categories. It actually shrank as a share of all jobs pretty substantially over this period. But one of the fastest growing occupation categories was truck drivers and drivers in general. And what was happening is automation was, this kind of Amazon, and other online retailers replacing brick and mortar retail. That was kind of technology driven. It was destroying jobs, but it was creating new jobs because now you have to hire a bunch of drivers to drive all the stuff to people. So that's another way that these automation stories are often more complicated than they appear on the surface. So I don't know how you incorporate that into the paper, but maybe you can just discuss it at least. So it was a pleasure to discuss the paper, Mary. Thank you. And look forward to seeing the next version.
Great. So we can take questions from the audience. You're welcome to use the raise hand function or type questions into Q&A. Let's see. So we have James, go ahead. James, if you want to unmute. Let's see. Okay, so it doesn't seem to be working at the moment. So why don't we see if you want to have any responses to the discussion, and then we can see if more questions come in.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I really appreciate your comments, David. I think those are excellent things that I have been thinking about while writing the paper. I will admit that finding the narrative was a bit tricky. So in regards to labor institutions, that was actually how we expected to find a larger effect in combination of the automation effect and something more consistent depending on the type of structure. And we took some time to really look into that. And what was shocking was we didn't find the story we thought we would in terms, there wasn't any consistency that these would have, the countries that had a higher protection might have less effect of automation than those that had lower protected. And so I think there's a lot more to uncover there as to why there's such varied stories in that regard. And so in the end, didn't really discuss it very in-depthly into this paper, just trying to create a stronger narrative. But something that we're still pondering. What was interesting from that is that the contract type did have some effect. It was, of course, country specific, but that's where we're thinking of why I included that marginally part-time is because and these other different part-time contracts, is that the kind of gig economy, which is not really seen very easily in the data because of the way it's structured, but you do see that a large increase in part-time work is starting to take root during this time period. And something, again, would want to dig in a little bit further as to understanding that. I really appreciate your suggestion about really detailing which jobs are shrinking and growing. I'm going to definitely include that. And there are a ton of appendix pages on descriptive statistics that talk also even the talking about the differences for each job. I do have the probability of being automated with Frey and Osborne, but I think giving it in a more succinct way would really provide a better narrative. We do talk a bit when being more specific about what we mean by automation, but I think we need to make it more clearly, because if it wasn't clear just in that read, then we need to talk about it more, which was really talking about the more rise of non-cognitive skills that could be used with machine learning, robotics, and those types of automative techniques. So the more recent kind of technology. And yeah, Frey and Osborne do have their caveats. I totally agree and hear you on that. I wish I had another measure. I have learned of one recently that we want to do to compare to see if there's like huge shifts on that. But I do hear you on the caveats, and I think we should maybe talk more about that in the paper. So thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Great. So I'll give James one more chance. If you did want to ask a question, I think you can unmute. If not, there you go. Did you have a question, James? Okay, clearly we've got some bug somewhere in the technology. So apologies for that. All right, and so let's see. Elizabeth Hoffman had a comment in the Q&A. Not sure if that's a comment or a question. Do you want to take a quick look, Mary?
Yeah. Okay, so her question is, I think they might be more related to the first presenters.
Yes, good point. Okay, yes, it just appeared, but good point. All right, so then let's, why don't we move on to Stephanie then, unless there's any other questions or comments. Any on the panel want to jump in? We have another minute or two. All right, Stephanie, are you ready? Great.
It's not letting me share the screen. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Can everyone see that? Okay.
Looks great, thanks.
Great. All right, well, thank you. This is joint work with Heather Royer and Corey White, and it's a project that's quite preliminary. So we're very looking forward to Maya's feedback and any feedback from the audience. And I believe Heather and maybe Corey are also online here to answer your questions in the chat as we go along. So the overarching goal of this project is to gain a more comprehensive understanding of how having access to obstetric care affects maternal and child health. So it's fairly well known that over the past 30 years, hospitals in rural areas have been closing at somewhat of alarming rates. And among the rural hospitals that remain open, a non-trivial share of those have closed their obstetric units or their OB units. OB units are just dedicated hospital services relating to the care and treatment of women during childbirth, but also during the period leading up to and following delivery. And the main goal of these units is to reduce maternal and infant mortality and morbidity. So to give you an idea of the severity of these closures, about 14.5% of OB units have closed over the last 30 years, between 1990 and 2017. And over the same period, there's been an upward trend in maternal mortality. And this is particularly the case in rural areas. And you can see that here in this figure. The rural trend is represented in the black line here. So one might wonder if the decline in OB care is at least in part causing this increase in maternal mortality. And so the aim of this project is to investigate if in fact this is the case, but then also to understand more broadly the consequences of these closures. These closures have been widely publicized, so if you Google rural OB unit closures, you'll find lots of articles in mainstream media outlets. And this is not just very recently, but back to the 90s. So highlighting that this has been an ongoing phenomenon. And some of these headlines even suggest that, that these closures are leading to maternal mortality. So why have OB units closed? There's a whole constellation of factors that likely contribute to these closures. And I'll just talk about a few in the interest of time. But the first three that I have up here are supply side factors. Rising costs in OB services, declining workforce. The one I think is kind of most common is mergers and consolidation. So this is where a large hospital system goes in and buys up a smaller hospital, and then they consolidate their services for efficiency reasons. And so what happens is often these smaller hospitals that are in rural areas are stripped of their specialty services, like, for example, OB units. The fourth possibility, or the reason they're closing, that I have up here has to do with a change in demand. And so we know populations are declining in rural areas. At the same time, they're becoming relatively older. And so hospitals may be shifting services toward the aging population and away from maternity care. And because we're interested in estimating the causal effect of these closures, if hospitals are closing in response to this declining demand, this could threaten the causal interpretation of our estimates. So we're going to do a lot to probe the possibility that these closures are due, the possibility that these closures are due to demand, to ensure that our estimates are not identified from this type of variation. So I'll go into that in a little bit, in a few slides. These are sort of the main reasons these OB units are closing. Before I get into the details of the analysis, I think it's important to think about the types of services that OB units provide, so that we know sort of what the treatment is and where we might expect to see effects. And so there's two main services, at least two main services OB units provide. The first is prenatal care. So these are like routine tests, information interventions of telling mothers how to have, informing them how to have a healthy pregnancy, and maybe early intervention of existing conditions. So we can think about this as like care leading up to birth. But the second type of services that they provide is interpartum care. So this is care at the time of labor and delivery. One thing to note here is that there's sort of two main channels in which these outcomes might be affected. There's this prenatal channel, or the conditions leading up to birth, and then there's this labor and delivery channel, or the conditions at the time of birth. So we want to keep these two channels in mind when we're thinking about the possible effects of these closures. So what are the possible effects of these closures? First, there's an increased cost of obtaining prenatal care. Again, this is thinking about worse conditions leading, prior to the birth. This could lead to decreases in gestation. So I guess to back up, if we're thinking about the expecting mother now has to drive to a nearby county She may miss some of her recommended prenatal appointments. This might be particularly the case if she's low income or working in a lower skilled job, where we know for the most part, those types of jobs don't provide sick leave. There is some evidence that prenatal care reduces early births. So with an increase in cost of prenatal care, we might expect to see lower gestation lengths and consequently lower birth weights. But these OB units will also increase the cost of obtaining interpartum care. This is, again, conditions at the time of birth. And this could result in more out-of-hospital births, an increase in the travel distance to the nearest OB unit, and ultimately it could result in increased child and maternal mortality or morbidity. What is important here, though, is that the conditions at the time of birth shouldn't really affect the outcomes in the first bullet point here, which is they should be affected, by the conditions leading up to birth. And so we hope, or we aim to use that that fact to try to disentangle these two channels. These are sort of these possibilities are often discussed among public health circles, but as economists, we want to consider an additional possibility, and that's that these closures actually might encourage women to seek services in higher quality hospitals, and therefore they could actually be welfare improving. Okay, so these are sort of counterbalancing effects, and we think that this ultimately is an empirical question. So what do we do in the paper, just to get on the same page here before we jump into the results? We're going to ask the question, how does OB unit access affect maternal and child health? We're going to study this in the setting of the US over the last 30 years, between 1990 and 2017, and we're going to employ 3 data sets: the American Hospital Association, and then 2 data sets from the National Vital Statistics System, both the natality files and the mortality files. We're going to use a very straightforward empirical design. We're going to use a difference in differences research design, where we're just going to leverage variation across counties and time in access to OB units. And our treatment is going to be a continuous measure of distance to the nearest OB unit, and that's in miles. I don't have time to go into the literature, but to the best of our knowledge, our contribution here is the first to causally estimate the effects of access to OB care in the US. And I think more broadly, this paper adds to our knowledge of the urban-rural health gap. So this next figure just is a visual representation of the variation that we're leveraging in this analysis. So it's showing changes in OB access over our time period, so between 1990 and 2017. And here we're defining access again as the distance between the population-weighted county centroid of the mother's county of residence and the population-weighted county centroid of the nearest county with an operational OB unit. So here, white counties are going to be counties that experience no change in distance over this time period. Green counties are going to be those that experience actually a decrease in distance over this time period. And then the black counties are those that experience an increase in distance. So as I mentioned, our empirical framework is a difference in differences research design. We're going to look at a number of outcomes, both those that likely are affected by the conditions leading up to birth and also at the time of birth. But importantly, our outcome is going to be at the county year level. Our main variable of interest, or our treatment here, again, is just the distance to the nearest OB unit in miles. We're going to include some time varying county level characteristics, county fixed effects, state by year fixed effects, and then we also include these urban group by year fixed effects. This really is a sort of a rural phenomenon, and this approach is following Bailey and Goodman's 2015 paper. And so, the thought experiment is pretty straightforward here. We're just comparing outcomes of mothers or infants in counties who experience no change in OB access to those who experienced a change. So, next we want to consider, before we jump into the results, we want to consider several possible threats to identification. The fundamental assumption here is the parallel trends assumption. We want to first check to make sure that the compositions of mothers is not changing over this time period. So we want to rule out the possibility that our effects are driven by the selection of the types of mothers giving birth in rural areas. To do this, we're going to estimate a series of balance regressions where we regress maternal characteristics and also the fertility rate on the treatment that I just showed you, and then the fixed effects that I just outlined in the last slide. And we want to see if the treatment has any predictive power, and if it doesn't, it'll help reassure us that that the estimates are at least not driven by sort of the types of mothers giving birth in rural areas. Next, we want to check to see if the timing of these closures coincide with the changes in the outcome in the outcomes. And so we're going to estimate event studies, and we're actually going to estimate event studies for all of our outcomes. And this is really just to help convince us that our estimates are not just picking up some trend that's occurring in the outcomes, and that really is in fact due to the change in access. And then finally, we're going to, we want to ensure that our treatment and control counties are comparable. And so we're going to implement a reweighting procedure where, we use county characteristics to predict out a county's propensity to experience a change in access. And then we're going to rerun our analysis with these p-scores as weights. And this is just going to essentially give more weight to control counties that are likely to experience a change in access and less weight to those who are not. It's essentially downweighting urban counties, and our findings seem to be robust to that reweighting. So next I'm going to jump into our results, and again, as I mentioned, I'm going to show you them in event study form. So I'll present to you a bunch of figures, and then at the bottom of each page, I'll also report the difference in differences coefficient. Before I do that, I'll show you the results from the balance test that I just described. So here we're really finding that fertility rate and maternal characteristics are not changing as a result of change in access. So the treatment doesn't seem to have predictive power here. That's reassuring. That's the case for marital status, education, race, ethnicity, and age. And then importantly, the fertility rate doesn't seem to be impacted by the change in access. And this is the case for both when we run the unweighted regressions, but also when we run the regressions that are weighted by the p-score. So now I'm going to show you the series of event studies and also report for you the difference in differences coefficient. So the first outcome we're going to look at is just the share of births in the county of mothers' residents. And we kind of think of this as a zero stage. This should, if closures, if these are actually closing, then we should observe fewer births in the mother's county of residence. And that's in fact what we find. There's about an 18 percentage point decline in the share of births in the county of residence. All of our different D&D coefficients are scaled by 30 miles. That's the average change in distance among the counties that experience a change. So they're not giving, there's a decrease in births in the county of residence. So where are they going? So next we're going to look at in the left panel here, we're going to look at the share of births in the hospital and then the share of births in homes. So, one might wonder if there's just an increase in births at home when a mother no longer has an OB unit in her county. And what we find is, there's some evidence that there's some substitution going on, but very few mothers seem to be substituting toward home births. And so if they're not giving birth at home, where then are they giving birth? And so next, we're going to look at the share of births in the nearby county with an OB unit. And in fact, we're actually looking at, we've defined the outcome as the share of births in the nearest 4 counties with an operational OB unit. And we see here that there's a large significant increase of 17.1 percentage points. So nearly all affected mothers, if you take the ratio of this and the coefficient from 2 slides back, that suggests that about 94% of mothers are traveling to a nearby OB unit. What kind of hospitals are they traveling to? So next we look at the share of births in counties with a NICU. And what we find here is mothers are much more likely to give birth in a county with a NICU. And so this, we sort of take this as a suggestive evidence that mothers are, giving birth in higher quality hospitals, or at least in hospitals with more resources. And then, of course, it's possible that just the change in access would now require a mother to give birth in a NICU. So to rule out that, we've predicted out a NICU score, risk score for each mother, and we don't find evidence that that's changing across change in access. And so we take that as, again, evidence that they're kind of being encouraged to go to hospitals with more resources. So that kind of summarizes where they're going as a result of these closures. Next, we want to look at health outcomes, and both for the mother and the infant. And there are, two, as I mentioned earlier, there are 2 types of outcomes. There's those that are affected by prenatal care, and then there are those outcomes that might be affected at the time of the conditions at the time of birth. So we'll first start with these first set of outcomes that might be affected by the conditions leading up to birth. So here we have the outcome is prenatal visits. What we find is that the exact timing of change in access, there seems to be a reduction in prenatal visits. So a pretty substantial reduction, about a 1% reduction. And, there's sort of mixed evidence on how prenatal visits affect health outcomes, but it's possible that they increase early births or premature births, or result in decreased birth weight. So next we'll look at those outcomes. So in the left panel here, we have average gestation length in weeks. We have early births in the middle, and then on the right we have premature births. And what you can see is there's some evidence here that there's a decrease in the average gestation length. And it seems, again, some evidence that it seems to be driven slightly by early births. But we don't find strong evidence or evidence that this more severe outcome of premature births is affected by these closures. Next, we'll look at birth weight. If these are, that's a possible outcome that could be affected by the conditions leading up to birth. And so we have birth weight here on the left. We have the share of low birth weight in the middle panel, and then on the right panel we have the share of very low birth weight. And we're not finding strong evidence of a change in birth weight. That's not very surprising, I think, given that we don't find effects on the last slide. I showed you we didn't find effects on premature births. So these don't seem to be affecting these more extreme outcomes. And then next, I'm going to show you an outcome. We'll move on to outcomes that are a function of the conditions at the time of birth. And we're going to start by looking at C-sections. So here we find a pretty substantial and non-trivial reduction in C-sections as a result of the closures. Of course, this could be due to at least two different reasons. It could be that mothers are just less in need of a C-section due to the OB unit closure, or because they're now going to to hospitals that are less likely to perform them. So there's, if you're familiar with this literature, there's like large variation in C-section rates across hospitals. And so it could be due to, mother characteristics, or it could be due to these hospital characteristics. This is something that we're currently looking into. Where I can get into that in a minute, but we basically need more granular data to look at that in more detail, but that's something that's on our to-do list and that we think would be quite interesting to disentangle. We also look at infant and maternal mortality. Infant mortality is on the left panel here, maternal mortality is on the right. We're really just not finding strong evidence that these closures are impacting these outcomes. These are pretty rare outcomes and pretty severe. So I guess it's not, again, entirely surprising given that our earlier findings that I showed you we weren't finding that the closures were affecting other kind of more severe outcomes. So, but nonetheless, we don't find strong evidence here. Just to summarize, I guess I'm doing all right in time here. Just to summarize, we find that a decrease in access unsurprisingly increases travel distance to OB units. We also find that it reduces the number of prenatal visits, and potentially as a result of that, it decreases gestation length, and that seems to be driven by an increase in early births. But on the other hand, we find that there's an increase in the share of births occurring in counties with a NICU, and there seems to be a decrease in C-sections. And I guess I should note that one thing we have probed a little bit is where that decrease in C-sections is coming from. So we've followed Curry and McCloyd 2012 Jolly paper, their approach that they use in that paper to try to predict out high risk and low risk mothers, so the risk of the birth based on mother characteristics. And it seems that from our sort of preliminary analysis here, it seems that the reduction in C-sections is coming from both high risk births and low risk births, but we have more to do to unpack that. Some next steps for us, as I mentioned, this is pretty preliminary. It's more of a project at this point. We're hoping to we've been waiting for almost, I think, over a year and a half now, detailed address level data from Texas DSHS. This would give us, so if we get these data, which it seems like we might actually be getting them in the next few weeks, we'd be able to observe mother's exact address along with the hospital of birth, rather than what we can observe now, which is just county of residence and county of birth. So having this more granular data will allow us to more accurately identify the counterfactual hospital, which will then allow us to test hypotheses about specific hospital characteristics. For example, the hospital quality is what we're quite interested in, and how that affects these outcomes. And we're in particular interested in the mechanism behind this reduction in C-sections. And then finally, we hope to try to unpack how the healthcare market is adjusting to these closures as well. And I'll conclude there.
Great. Thank you so much for that terrific presentation. So our discussant is Maya Rawson-Slater from Stanford. So Maya, you can take it away. And Stephanie, can you stop sharing?
Yes, yep.
Thanks.
Please stop share.
Great. Let me just share my screen. Okay. So first of all, thank you so much for including me in this fantastic session. Thank you everybody for being here. It's a treat to get to discuss the paper of my former colleagues and students, Stephanie, Heather, and Corey. At UCSB. And I should also say that I think it's pretty awesome that a paper on maternal and child health is included in a session about the economics of inequality. I think typically when we talk about inequality and economists researching inequality, we tend to think about kind of income inequality or wage inequality and economic outcomes. Of course, there's now all kinds of evidence suggesting that health inequality is quite pervasive. I would say a lot of that research has focused on measures like life expectancy or mortality, or, including research, but some folks on this call, early life health and its implications for long-term well-being and economic outcomes. And I think maternal health has comparably received less attention in that discussion. And that's, I think a mistake, especially in light of the fact that there have been some troubling trends in maternal health in recent years, in the United States in particular. So all that's to say is I think it's an important, highly policy relevant project, and I'm excited to get to learn more about it. So just to give a bit more context, I think Stephanie mentioned a little bit of this at the beginning of her presentation, but the United States is the only country in the world in which the maternal mortality rate has increased in the last 25 years, right? Basically everywhere else in the world, the maternal mortality rate has been falling. And moreover, as is the case with a lot of other health outcomes, there's huge disparities in maternal health in the United States. So one such disparity that's often cited, for example, is that Black women are 3.3 times more likely to die from a pregnancy or a childbirth related complication than non-Hispanic white women. And I think here, one disparity that they're emphasizing that I think is also quite relevant and potentially intersects with some other disparities, as well as the urban-rural divide. So they cite some numbers that are relevant in the trends. I found a paper, a health affairs paper that has the following statistics, which is that conditional and demographic characteristics, so holding constant things like race and other population level characteristics. In 2007, rural mothers had an 8 percentage point higher rate of severe maternal morbidity. So these are various maternal health conditions that could lead to death, but don't necessarily do, than urban mothers. And this disparity increased to 11 percentage points. So that's a fairly large increase especially in terms of relative terms by 2015, and it's continued to grow. And I think generally speaking, when we think of maternal health during pregnancy and around the time of childbirth in particular, access to OB care is perceived to be an important determinant of health and health care. But there's surprisingly little causal evidence on the extent to which access to this care actually influences maternal health, or to what extent disparities in access to this care, impact disparities in maternal health. And moreover, this is sort of coupled with the fact that there's these huge big trends in terms of declining access to OB care in rural areas. And so I think a really important and natural question to ask is, could this be related to the widening gap in maternal health that we're observing between urban and rural mothers? So again, just to reemphasize, I think this is an important and highly policy relevant study. So one thing that I was sort of interested in is this, and I think the authors could probe a little bit more, is this idea of this trade-off. So on the one hand, right, when you have less hospitals operating in rural areas that provide OB care, you worry that mothers are now going to have to travel further, right? So they might deliver their babies outside of the hospital, they might get less prenatal care, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, they might end up going to higher quality providers, right? Whether that's to get their prenatal care or to deliver at the hospital. So there's this natural trade-off that Stephanie talked about. And I think there's an interesting sort of parallel and contrast here with a trend in the de-regionalization of neonatal intensive care unit care. So NICU care for very preterm, very low birth weight, or otherwise ill babies. So a big trend in the provision of that care over the last few decades is actually kind of the opposite, which has been the diffusion of NICUs to sort of community hospitals, right? So it used to be that only kind of big academic hospitals had NICUs and then other hospitals did not. Now there's many more hospitals that do have NICUs, but the concern is that those NICUs have lower levels of care, lower quality care, and less patient volume. So then by having less patient volume, there's less learning in terms of how to treat very high-risk cases. And therefore, there's sort of various medical studies and some policy studies that argue that this trend is correlated with actually worse neonatal outcomes. So these studies tend to find that having kind of more access to NICUs is going to lead to lower quality NICUs being available to mothers and their children, and is actually going to lead to worse outcomes. So it invokes this sort of interesting question, I think, that whether, could it be that mothers are now potentially getting worse OB care, right? Because they have to travel further, they're getting fewer prenatal care appointments. But the trade-off is that their infants are potentially born in hospital with higher level of NICUs. Now they find some evidence suggesting this, right? Mothers are more likely to deliver in a county that has a NICU, but I had a question about where this NICU variable is currently coming from. So birth certificates are notoriously bad at reporting NICU care. And I think the other thing is, I think what's really important here is not just whether there's any NICU, but the level of that NICU. So NICUs have 4 levels. And I think level 3 and up is generally considered sort of ones that can provide all the kind of the care for the highest risk babies. So I think it would be important to try to understand more granularly what kind of NICUs are available. And more granular data on NICU levels at various hospitals exist. At least I'm most familiar with California, and California has that data. And I'm happy to chat with you guys offline more about that. And just generally, I think it would be interesting to explore this potential maternal versus infant health trade-off, especially for sort of the subgroup of women who have high-risk conditions and infants who have high-risk conditions. The other sort of data-related points that I wanted to raise, I should say, by the way, I have like no concerns basically about the empirical method. I think it's very solid. I think they've done kind of what anybody should do with this type of diff and diff model. So all my comments here are mostly about kind of other things to think about and other types of data and sort of mechanisms and things like that. So related to that, obviously, maternal mortality is an important indicator, but also, thankfully, it's relatively rare, even though it's increasing over time. So this leads me to wonder whether you could analyze kind of other important indicators of maternal health, such as maternal morbidity. So for example, could you use inpatient data to study maternal hospitalizations during pregnancy and in the postpartum period? I know you guys are waiting for Texas data. I don't know if that's just births data or also hospital records data, but more generally, you could potentially get data from at least a few states from the state inpatient databases to potentially look at this. And then of course, there's sort of various other data sets out there that could allow you to study less extreme measures of health. So for instance, you might consider things like insurance claims data, so the Optum database, where you could potentially study outpatient care and prescription drugs. There's limitations, limited in terms of the types of individuals you're going to observe in those data sets, but just additional sort of outcomes you might think about. More, I think maternal health is such a sort of, at least for economists, a newish topic. There's really, I think, a lot of scope to provide important evidence on the determinants of maternal health. So I think if you can broaden this to think about various measures of maternal health, I think it would be quite impactful. I also agree, and I know you guys are sort of thinking about this more deeply in terms of why you see a reduction in C-sections, and that's an interesting finding. It would be useful to try to understand whether this is being driven by sort of changes in planned C-sections or kind of emergency C-sections, although I know the data on that is somewhat limited. I don't think you mentioned this in the presentation you gave, whether there's any changes in the inductions of labor or various labor delivery complications. Maybe the Texas data will allow you to get at that. Again, you could use hospital records data to look at that as well. Then the other thing is sort of in terms of the mechanisms. So I would say, like, broadly speaking, the evidence on the relationship between the number of prenatal care visits and infant health is somewhat mixed. And I think generally quantity of visits, so just number of visits a woman gets, which is what's reported on the birth certificate, might matter less than the quality of those visits. And I also think that the relationship might not be linear, right? So for instance, missing one's 20-week anatomy ultrasound, where you might detect various issues with the baby, might be more consequential than sort of missing a regular kind of monthly appointment. I don't know if there's any way to investigate this, again, maybe like in the insurance claims data, but it does seem sort of interesting and relevant in this context. And then one last sort of point that's somewhat more minor is, the finding on gestation length. You see that it's being driven by an increase in what's called early births. So these are births at 37 to 39 weeks, rather than kind of preterm births, so less than 37 weeks. And I was curious whether this could be somehow related actually to the decline in potentially planned C-sections, right? C-sections could only typically be scheduled after 39 weeks. So you see a decline in C-sections. Is that, do you then correspondingly see an increase in early births? And maybe the Texas data will allow you to think about that as well. Those are all the comments I have. Thanks again for including me in the session. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thanks so much for that terrific discussion. Do you want to take a quick minute to respond? I don't see questions in the Q&A yet, but if anyone in the audience wants to put them in the Q&A, you're welcome to.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Maya. Those are great, lots of great comments that we can definitely think about implementing. I think your first slide about the context is really helpful to think about broadly where this fits. As far as the NICU data, I think you asked about that. That comes to the AHA, which also has its problems. So you mentioned that the birth certificate data, it's not great quality, but also in the AHA, it's a survey, so it's also has some issues. So if we can get better data on NICUs, I think that would be useful, as you mentioned. Some of the things, yeah, you mentioned like inductions. We can do that actually with, I think we can do that with the data we currently have, and it's on our to-do list, so we'll definitely do that. And then I think your idea about looking more at some outcomes of morbidity outcomes is a good one as well. But I can follow up with you, or the three of us can follow up with you offline too. But I think in general, those are really helpful comments, and if we can get the right data, we can implement them.
So I don't see questions coming in yet. Let's see. Actually, no, Michelle, you had a question. Do you want to ask it live?
Okay, sure. I'm not able to post this Q&A somehow.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you have any data on continuity of care. Like, I could imagine that if your hospital closes, you might have a local midwife or a local doctor for your pregnancy, and then somebody else in child leave for birth. That's something that you can see, and if that affects health outcomes.
Yeah, and the data we're currently using, we can't observe that. We only observe the number of prenatal visits. But I think that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah,
that actually reminds me, my former students, Amalia Miller and Catherine Tucker, had a paper that showed that privacy regulations around EMRs hurt infant mortality in states that had implemented those privacy regulations, which was suggestive of continuity of care issues, which could sort of interact with what you're asking about, Michelle. Maybe one other big picture question is, so this is like an underlying theme in all of this is about choice. So in some sense, you would think that in general the simple economic models say more choice is better for women, but then we were talking about trade-offs that perhaps, forcing them to travel farther to better hospitals could possibly make them better off in some ways and worse off in other ways. I'm wondering, do you have thoughts about other policies that would help allow people to have better choices while still getting them to the right care that matches them best?
Not off the top of my head.
That's beyond your paper.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Well, no, I think that's an interesting point. I don't have, I can't think of one off the top of my head. Heather, do you have any thoughts on that one? In the last 3 seconds here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be interesting to see how the scope of the network, the allowable network, when the hospital closes, maybe the network for the local insurers becomes bigger. And so maybe that's part of the effect. So that would be kind of an interesting outcome to look at, which should be sort of what does the insurance company do in response to these closures?
Great. Yeah, and this is something I've actually been working on with a student from Yale about matching of patients to providers. It's a hard question, but it seems like as we go forward and think about regulating, providing more price information and all of the different types of things we're looking at now could possibly help with some of that matching quality information and so on to get people to the best matches. Well, so thanks. We're just about out of time. So, so thanks so much to all of the speakers and discussants. This was a really terrific session. Thanks to CSWEP for organizing a session on inequality. And a lot of us at the beginning of the call, a lot of us actually didn't know each other before. So it's really nice that we got to see, theory and health economics and sort of look at more aggregate data, all to take different angles on these important inequality questions. So it was great for me to get to know everybody better and see this terrific work. So thanks everyone so much for the great panel.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
take care.
Nice to meet y'all.